Hello, and welcome to the Alternate History Class podcast. My name is Andrew, and here I explore alternate history through the lens of a history class in an alternate timeline. Last week, we looked at how the U.S. responded to their diplomatic victory in the Hamburg Agreement. This week, we'll look at how the Confederacy responded to a bold new era without slavery. Alright, when we last left off with the Confederacy, they had agreed to the Hamburg Agreement, and President John Gordon had narrowly defeated his opponent in the race, putting a narrow hold on Eastern Democratic superiority. Now, one of the first things the Confederacy had to do was create a series of laws regarding the new status of slaves and former slaves in the Confederacy. As you may remember, this was a condition of British support in the Hamburg Agreement. These laws, simply known as the Black Codes, covered a variety of topics, including the emancipation that was going to take place, the education of slaves, how the races were to interact, and where blacks could and could not work. When it came to emancipation, slaves born before the official independence of the Confederacy, which they determined to be the end of the War of Secession, so before 1863, would be slaves until the day they died. They would remain the property of their owners. At this point, they could not be sold to another owner, but they could be inherited. As it came for slaves born after the War of Secession, and up until February 4th of 1881, which was the date that the Confederacy officially passed the Hamburg Agreement, the slaves would be slaves until the end of the century. And those born after the ratification of the Hamburg Agreement were born free residents of the Confederacy. Now that word residence is key here. The Confederates, as most whites did at the time, viewed blacks as not their equals, viewed the white race as superior. This was only emphasized in a nation that had held on to slavery an additional 20 years, nearly, after their northern neighbor. So these were not citizens, they had no rights, but they were legally allowed to live in the Confederacy. When it came to the education of blacks, that was also extremely limited, to only be legal if was required for the black for their job, which, as we'll see in just a moment, was not the case for a large percentage of blacks, at least not initially. When it came to interracial interactions, the Confederacy was strictly segregated. Whites and blacks would not sit at the same tables. If a white and a black were in the same store, the black would not be served until all the whites in the store had already been served. And when it came to any situation, if it benefited a white to go first, they would go first. The whites would get the best seats in any transportation. They would get the best booths in the diners. They would get the best of everything, while the blacks would have to make do with what they could scrounge together. Now, when it came to how the blacks would make a living in this society, the majority of jobs made available to blacks were manual labor jobs, such as they had already had. Many of them working in fields, in some cases clearing forests, whatever it may be. But the key point was that the jobs had to serve whites. There had to be a white supervisor, a white overseer for any group of blacks that were working. Now, when we talked about the United States, we briefly touched upon Prohibition. Prohibition was much more popular in the Confederacy. The popular opinion among many people who were already in favor of Prohibition before the Hamburg Agreement was that the needing to release their slaves, the needing to be in that position, a position they viewed as immoral, was in large part due as a punishment from God for their sins, specifically when it came to alcoholism. And so the first Prohibition laws were passed in the Confederacy in Texas and Arkansas in 1881. And only 4 years later, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Florida would also pass similar laws, as would Sequoia in 1890. Now, this was something that was contained mostly to the West Confederacy, as we can see here, or the lower population states in the Confederacy. Now, when it came to politics, this would be the most turbulent time before the Great War. In the 1882 midterms, the Jacksonians, which were formerly called the Jacksonian Democrats, they had just simplified their name, would win control of the Confederate House and several governorships, including a surprise victory in South Carolina, taking their governor mansion. It was an absolute shock, as the Jacksonians had never won a governorship east of the Appalachians before that race. And that would only be a sign of things to come. In 1884, Richard B. Hubbard, the Jacksonian presidential candidate, would make President John Gordon the first Confederate president to lose a re-election bid. And he would also become the first, and as it would turn out, the last Jacksonian president of the Confederacy. The Jacksonians would slowly start to lose ground, however, as free blacks became more and more of a begrudgingly accepted reality, as they would narrowly retain control of the Confederate House in 1886, Hubbard would win re-election, but was only a narrow victory over James Kemper in 1888. And after losing 2 presidential elections and not having control of the House since 1882, the Democrats would rebrand themselves in a similar fashion to how the opponents of Andrew Jackson had rebranded themselves, renaming themselves the Whigs in 1890, which would be the first year that the Whigs would gain control of the Confederate legislature for the first time. And in 1892, John Tyler Morgan, the first presidential candidate under the Whig banner officially, would defeat the Jacksonian presidential candidate Samuel McHenry. He would go on to win re-election against John Marshall Stone in 1896, and Wade Hampton III, the hero of the Raid of Pittsburgh, would defeat a renominated Stone in the election of 1900, becoming the first South Carolinian governor to become president of the Confederacy. This was a very domestically focused period of time for the Confederacy, as they had to readjust to a new norm, and many states began to put a ban on alcohol in an attempt to repent for their sins that they saw had led, at least in their eyes, to the freeing of those slaves. It led to a turbulent time in democratic politics. But soon things would calm down as both nations would experience a calm before the storm that was the Great War. Thank you for checking out the Alternate History class on YouTube. If you enjoyed this week's episode, feel free to like the video, and if you want to see each video when it goes live, subscribe and hit that bell. The Alternate History class can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find podcasts. Big thank you to my patrons. If you'd like to support the show, you become a patron, and if you're in the top 2 tiers, you'll get a shout out at the end of each episode after you sign up. Thank you for your most important donation, your time, and I'll see you next time as we journey down the path not taken.